So let's talk about the habit of delegation. It's one a lot of leaders struggle with. I think it's a good example. And you've got this example of time debt, time assets
Mm.
that I think ties to the issue of delegation. And you also talk about replacing the bad habits. So we all have the habit of we check the email, there's a fire to deal with. And so we go deal with the fire of the day instead of pausing, delegating. And it's not always a control freak issue. It's just I'm the guy who deals with the problems. How can leaders get better at that?
I'm definitely the wrong person to ask this question to because I feel like I'm terrible at delegating and run into the same problems that everybody else does. I think although I'm bad at delegating, I may be good at a different skill which applies to this question, which is trying to focus on the high leverage work. And I think time assets and time debts, which I'll describe in just a moment, that's definitely something I consider to be a high leverage, like decision making mindset or a high leverage way of thinking about where to direct your time. So the core idea is very simple. It's just that some things that you invest your time into are assets and they pay you back in the future and they benefit you. The work that you put in continues to work for you once it's done. Other things that you invest your time in are time debts. And when you commit to it, it's putting you on the hook to spend time in the future. So any meeting that you commit to, once you block that hour off on your calendar, that's a debt that has to be repaid a week from now or a month from now when the meeting happens. You don't get that hour anymore. I view a time asset as something like writing Atomic Habits, for example. I spent thousands of hours writing that book. It was like a really long process. But all of those hours are still working for me right now. There are people out there reading the book, recommending it, buying it. And so that work is continuing to get more and more valuable. Each of those hours that I spent is continuing to pay off more and more into the future. So in a sense, when you're focused on time assets, on things where, and again, I think the central question is just, what is the work that keeps working for me once it's done? Those are ways that you invest your time. Time debts are ways that you spend your time. And the difference between the person who invests their time and the person who spends their time grows with each passing day. It becomes an enormous gap over the long run. So as another example, when the book first came out, I did a bunch of different interviews to promote it. And a lot of them were podcasts, some of them were radio. I don't really like doing radio interviews anymore because the work that I do for those interviews vanishes as soon as we go off air. As soon as I get done talking and the segment ends, nobody's hearing it anymore. But a podcast, by contrast, is recorded. And so there are people listening to other podcasts I've recorded right now somewhere. It's almost like there are multiple versions of James out there, and they're all kind of working at the same time. And so again, that was an hour or a block of time where the work is continuing to work for me once it's done. And the more that you don't even have to do this all the time. Like there's just stuff that we have to get done to run our businesses, and that's fine. That's just kind of part of it. It's like having a garden. Like every now and then you just need to weed. There are just things that you need to do to keep the business running. But if you can just do one high leverage thing a day like that, where the hour that you spend or the time that you spend is going to keep working for you once it's done, man, you only have to do that for a year or two or three, and all of a sudden things are way easier than they were before. The person who continues to invest their time rather than spending their time, it's almost like it becomes easier to get better results once you get that flywheel running, once you get the snowball rolling downhill. So I think that is time assets and time debts is just one way to think about it. Trying to focus on the highest leverage behaviors is another way to think about it. But that general idea of investing your time into things that will continue to work for you once the time is spent, it is very simple to say, a little bit harder to do, but man, it can be really powerful to implement over the long run.